This video is going to cover price indices and inflation. If you had $100 in 2001, you would need $141.56 today to buy the same amount of goods. So similar to that example, $100.85, you'd need $234.95 today. You'd need $423.70 if you had $100 to spend in 1977, and so on. $100 in 1913, you'd need $25.29.26 today. How do we measure inflation? Inflation is the rising general level of prices, and it ends up reducing your purchasing power. So it takes $2 to buy what would have cost you $1 in 1989, and it takes $6 to buy what $1 would have bought you in 1972, and $25 what $1 would have bought you in 1913. So when inflation occurs, each dollar of income will buy fewer goods than before. So where do you think each of these goods and services would belong on this graph? This graph shows price changes from 1997 to 2017. So no surprise here that the cost of health care and college tuition and textbooks have outpaced all other inflation related to these other goods. And here's a chart that's published by the Bureau of Labor that represents monthly inflation from 1872 to the present. So you can see certain times during war times when inflation was really high. During the 70s and 80s, we had a period of stagflation where you have high inflation and also high unemployment. Recently, inflation has been relatively low. And here is a chart illustrating projected annual inflation until the year 2022. So inflation is projected to be relatively low until that time. Is inflation good or bad? High inflation is bad because banks will not lend and people don't save. This will decrease investment, so business investment that is, in gross domestic product. What about deflation, where you actually have prices falling? Deflation is also not good because people will hoard money in assets. This will decrease consumer spending in GDP. And if you remember, consumer spending is the largest component of GDP. And the concept of disinflation means that prices are increasing but at a slower rate. How do we measure inflation? The government tracks the prices of specific market baskets that include the same goods and services. There's two ways that we can look at inflation over time. You can look at the inflation rate, that is the percent change in prices from one year to the next, or you can use a price index. And these are index numbers that are assigned to each year that show how prices have changed relative to a specific base year. So examples, the U.S. inflation rate in 2014 was 0.8%, and the consumer price index for 2014 was 235. And the base year that was used is 1982. So that means that prices have increased 135% since 1982. And we'll get to practicing these calculations. The Consumer Price Index is the most commonly used measure of inflation. So you have a base year and that index is 100, and you compare it each year to an index number as well. So you take the price of the market basket over the price of the market basket in the base year times 100. So if we use an example here, the market basket value in the base year here is 20, and then in the price of the market basket in 2009 is 25. So if you take 25 over 20 times 100, you're going to get an increase in inflation of 25%. So an item that would cost $100.97 would cost $125 in 2009. So here's some practice calculations. And year one would be used as your base year. So applying this formula here, the CPI for year one, which is the base year, is always 100. For year two would be 125, and for year three it would be 150. So here are some practice calculations. And a hint is you're looking for the change in price, not the change in output. So here's the formula. So remember that year one is always your base. So you're going to compare 10 divided by 8 times 100. So we know our base year is always 100. 2 would be 125. For year three, you're comparing 12 divided by 8. Because again, year one is the base year, and that would give you 150, and so on. Then your inflation rate, you take the new rate, new CPI minus the old divided by the old. So here would be 25%, this is 20, minus 66, 300%, and 50, minus 50. So there are some issues with the consumer price index. And the first is the substitution bias. So as prices increase for a fixed basket of goods, consumers will buy less of those products and more substitutes. So those goods might not actually be part of the basket. So the CPI may be higher than what consumers are actually paying. New products. The CPI market basket may not include the newest consumer products that we're buying. So the CPI measures prices, not the increase in choices. Product quality. The CPI ignores both improvements as well as declines in product quality. So the CPI may suggest that prices stay the same, though the economic well-being has improved because the products have improved. This graph shows the items that are included in the market basket for the Consumer Price Index. The government's role is to prevent unemployment and prevent inflation happening at the same time. So if the government focuses too much on preventing inflation and slows the economy down, we're going to have unemployment. And if the government focuses too much on limiting unemployment and the economy begins to overheat, we'll have inflation. So if unemployment is 6% or less, that's good. 1 to 4% inflation would be good, and 2.5 to 5% GDP growth would be good. We'd start to worry when inflation goes beyond that natural rate of unemployment of over 6%. If inflation is around 5 to 8%, it's not good, and if GDP is growing very slowly at 1 or 2%. If you've got high unemployment here, this would be 8.5%, would not be good. If you have that also with high inflation and very low GDP growth, then that would signal a very unhealthy economy.